Hello everyone, friends. Have you ever come across stories that send chills down your spine? You know, sometimes life twists plots that are wilder than any movie. Today, I have gathered 30 cases that sound completely made up, but they actually happened. Prepare some tea, settle in comfortably. I promise it will be very intriguing. If you enjoy stories presented in this format, please support this series with a like, and let us know in the comments which city you are listening from. This greatly aids the growth of our community. Let's dive in. Story number 1. The man who sold the symbol of France for scrap metal. Paris, spring 1925. The City of Light is just beginning to recover after the Great War. Jazz once again fills the streets. Artists are debating in cafes on Montmartre. Yet, the country's economy is crumbling. Amidst all this splendor, like a rusty nail, stands the Eiffel Tower. Today it's hard for us to imagine this, but nearly 100 years ago, the Iron Lady was regarded as an ugly temporary structure. It was built for the Definite 28 exhibition, and its time of use had long expired. The paint was peeling, the metal was rusting, and maintenance costs were astronomical. Parisians wrote furious letters demanding that this tragic street lamp be taken down. In a luxurious room at the Crayon Hotel sat a man reading a newspaper filled with these complaints and smiling. His name was Victor Lustig. Dressed in a pristine three-piece suit, he spoke 5 languages and had a charisma capable of convincing a tiger to become a vegetarian. He wasn't an engineer or a government official. He was the greatest con artist of his time and had just devised the boldest scam in history. Lustig forged official documents from the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs. He sent invitations to the 5 largest scrap dealers in Paris for a secret, urgent meeting. The gathering took place at the same hotel. Presenting himself as the Deputy Director General of the Ministry, Lustig lowered his voice and revealed a state secret. The French government, unable to bear the repair costs of the Eiffel Tower any longer, had made a grave decision. The tower would be demolished. And he, Victor Lustig, was authorized to conduct a private tender for the right to dispose of 7,000 tons of prime metal. The businessmen listened to him, holding their breath. This was the opportunity of a lifetime. But Lustig was a keen psychologist. He didn't choose the wealthiest victim. He targeted the one who was the most insecure. André Poisson was a provincial businessman who dreamed of entering the elite circles of Parisian society. Purchasing the Eiffel Tower would be his ticket to the top. However, Poisson was hesitant. The deal felt far too secret and too swift. André's wife began to raise uncomfortable questions. Why were the meetings held at a hotel instead of the ministry? The scam was hanging by a thread. Then, Lustig made a brilliant move. He arranged a personal meeting with Poisson and started lamenting about life. He hinted that the salary of a civil servant was minuscule, and that life in Paris was incredibly expensive. He effectively solicited a bribe. Immediately, Poisson felt a weight lift off his shoulders. If an official requests a bribe, it suggests he is a true, honest individual. Suspicion would arise otherwise, as a corrupt bureaucrat was a clear and familiar part of the system. André Poisson not only wrote a check for a massive amount of nearly 70,000 francs for the purchase of a tower around the year 1900, which would today equate to roughly $1 million, but also provided Lustig with a substantial additional bribe. Upon receiving a suitcase filled with money, Lustig promptly boarded a train to Vienna. The following morning, Poisson arrived at the tower accompanied by a crew of workers ready to commence dismantling. One can only imagine the expressions on the faces of the real guards and custodians when presented with fake documents for the demolition of a national treasure. Poisson's shame was so profound that he did not even report to the police. He feared becoming a laughingstock for the entire city of Paris. Thanks to this silence, Lustig not only evaded arrest. After a month, realizing he was not being pursued, he returned to Paris in an attempt to sell the tower once more, this time to another dealer. However, during the second attempt, the vigilant victim contacted the authorities, forcing Lustig to flee to America. This man sold air encapsulated in the form of 7,000 tons of iron, relying only on the greed and vanity of his victims. But while Lustig depended on psychology, The heroes of our next story encountered a phenomenon that defied any logic. They found themselves at the center of a war where the enemy knew no fear, felt no pain, and, most alarmingly, could outrun a car. Story number 2, The Great War Against the Emus, or How Machine Guns Were Defeated by Birds. Australia. The western part of the continent, the Champion area, November 1932. The world stands on the brink of significant upheaval. But here, in the sun-scorched steppe, unfolds a conflict that will be recorded in history books as the most absurd military operation ever. Opponents, the Royal Australian Artillery, armed with the latest Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The enemy, 20,000 emus. Yes, you heard correctly. These giant, flightless, seemingly foolish birds had migrated to this area in search of water and began to devastate wheat crops. Farmers, veterans of the First World War, panicked and turned to the government for help. Minister of Defense George Pearce, eager to demonstrate strength, dispatched Major Meredith, a sergeant, and 2 machine gunners to the front. The plan was straightforward: locate the flock, open fire, and collect feathers for cavalry hats. Major Meredith was confident of a swift victory. Emus were stupid, and the machine gun represented the pinnacle of progress, he believed. On the 2nd of November, the first shots were fired, and then the terrible truth was revealed. The emus proved to be experts in guerrilla warfare. As soon as shooting began, the birds did not group together like sheep. They instantly scattered in a fan, running in all directions at a speed of 50 kilometers per hour. Hitting a running emu with a heavy machine gun turned out to be more challenging than downing a fighter jet. Their feathers were so stiff and dense that bullets often simply lodged in the plumage, causing no mortal wounds unless they struck vital organs. Major Meredith noted in his diary, "These birds have commanders. Each flock is led by a large black bird that stands guard while the others feed. At the slightest hint of danger, it signals and they vanish into the dust." The military altered its tactics. They set up an ambush at the watering hole. 1,000 emus approached the water. Machine gunners opened fire at close range. The birds fell, but then jumped up and ran away. The machine gun jammed after the first burst. The result of the ambush? 12 birds were killed, and the ammunition spent numbered in the hundreds. In despair, Meredith ordered a machine gun to be mounted on a truck to pursue the enemy. This ended in failure. The truck bounced over the rough terrain so much that the shooter couldn't aim, while the emus easily outran the vehicle off-road. Ultimately, the truck crashed into a fence, and the tank attack faltered. After a week of fighting, Major Meredith had to concede defeat and retreat. In his report, he lamented, "If we had a division with the stamina of these birds, it could withstand any army in the world." They faced machine gun fire with the invulnerability of tanks. Outcome of the war? The army expended almost 10,000 rounds. Estimates of the birds killed range from several dozen to several hundred. There were no casualties among the troops. However, the dignity of the Australian army was thoroughly destroyed. The emus remained the masters of the fields. Farmers had to build fences on their own, technology that turned out to be more effective than artillery. This story teaches us that nature cannot be conquered by brute force. Our next story's hero tried to overcome nature with cunning. He resolved to steal an entire island, literally digging it up with a shovel to create his own state, where the laws would be dictated by his madness. Story number 3, A Republic Built on Sand and Audacity. The Pacific Ocean, south of the Tonga Islands, 1971. American millionaire Michael Oliver, who made his fortune selling real estate and coins, grew weary of taxes and government oversight. He was a libertarian to the core and dreamed of a place without a state. Since no free land was left on the world's map, he decided to create his own. Oliver discovered the Minerva Reef, 2 horseshoe-shaped coral formations that were submerged during high tide. No man's land. No nation had claimed rights to it, as it was merely a dangerous shoal in the middle of the ocean. Oliver hired a barge loaded with sand from Australia. Tons of sand were dumped onto the reef, raising it above sea level. On this artificial piece of land, He planted a flag and proclaimed the establishment of the Republic of Minerva. He issued his own currency, the Minerva dollar, printed passports, and sent letters to the leaders of 100 nations requesting recognition. He promised no taxes, complete freedom for entrepreneurs, and a paradise for investors. The world shook its head, but the neighboring kingdom of Tonga took it seriously. The king of Tonga, Taufa Ahau Tupou I, was an imposing figure both in status and stature, weighing around 200 kilograms. He reviewed the map and decided he would not tolerate a smuggler's base next door. In June 1972, the king personally led a military expedition. The Tonga fleet, comprising one royal yacht, an amphibious craft, and a tugboat, approached Minerva. On board was the king himself, the state orchestra, and a group of prisoners designated as Marine infantry. The battle for the Republic of Minerva was brief. President Oliver and his administration wisely were not present. The Tongan soldiers, previously known as Zeki, landed on the sandy shore, lowered the Minervan flag, and raised the flag of Tonga. Standing knee-deep in water, the orchestra solemnly performed the national anthem. The king proclaimed the reefs as part of the kingdom's territory. Michael Oliver attempted to contest this at the United Nations, but no one came to the defense of the sandcastle. In a few years, nature completed what the king had started. Storms washed away the sandy ground, and the Republic of Minerva vanished beneath the waves once more, becoming merely a line in the annals of curiosities. Michael Oliver tried to create a nation from nothing, but the hero of our next story fashioned something extraordinary from refuse. He built a palace that became a monument to loneliness and rejected love, using only what others discarded as trash. Story number 4. The Postman Who Built a Castle Out of Dreams and Stones. France, the locality of Autrive, 1879. Ferdinand Cheval was an ordinary rural postman. He was 43 years old. He was silent, reserved, and walked 32 kilometers each day. He delivered letters to the surrounding villages. His life appeared gray and bleak, much like the dusty road beneath his feet. But one day in April, his foot caught on a strangely shaped stone. Cheval picked it up. The stone reminded him of some fantastical creature. He placed it in his pocket. The following day he found another stone, and then another. In the mind of this simple postman, who had never ventured beyond his canton and had no architectural training, a mad idea took root. He resolved to build the perfect palace, a palace that would encompass all styles and epochs of every god and being he had seen on postcards and in magazines delivered to recipients. Every day for the next 33 years, Ferdinand Cheval set out on his route with a wheelbarrow. While delivering mail, he gathered stones. The locals considered him to be crazy. They observed him, exhausted after his shift, mixing cement by the light of an oil lamp at night, laying his finds. He built alone. His palace grew slowly, like a living organism. It was not a building in the conventional sense. It was a hallucination made of stone. There were Hindu temples, Egyptian tombs, medieval castles, Swiss chalets, and mosques. The walls were adorned with figures of octopuses, caimans, elephants, and fairies. He wove seashells and glass into the stone. Cheval completed his construction in 1912, at the age of 76. The palace measured 26 meters in length and 10 meters in height. He wished to be buried in his creation, like a pharaoh. However, French laws prohibited burial outside of cemeteries. Cheval did not give up. At the age of 78, he went to the local cemetery and began to build again. For another 8 years, he erected a mausoleum of silence and eternal peace in that same fantastic style. He died at 88, just 1 year after the completion of the mausoleum. His perfect palace still stands today, acknowledged as a masterpiece of naive architecture, a testament to the determination of an individual who proved that a dream can be built with one's own hands, stone by stone. While Cheval built to leave a legacy, the hero of our next tale became famous for vanishing without a trace, a name, or a parachute with which he jumped from an airplane carrying a bag of money. Story number 5. A Ghost in a Business Suit and $200,000. Portland, Airport. The 24th of November, 1971. The eve of Thanksgiving. A man in his 40s, dressed in a dark suit, white shirt, and black tie, with a pearl pin, approaches the Northwest Orient Airlines ticket counter. He purchases a one-way ticket to Seattle under the name D.B. Cooper. He pays in cash. He takes seat 187 aboard a Boeing 727. He orders a bourbon and soda. He is polite, calm, and blends in seamlessly. Shortly after takeoff, he hands a note to the flight attendant. The young woman, used to passenger flirtations, slips it into her pocket without reading. "Miss, you might want to take a look at that note," Cooper gently insists. "I have a bomb." He opens his briefcase. Inside, the flight attendant sees red cylinders, wires, and a large battery. His demands were specific and strangely modest for such a risk. $200,000 in $20 bills and 4 parachutes. Not 2, but 4. This led the police to believe he planned to take hostages. The plane circled above Seattle while money and parachutes were gathered on the ground. Cooper remained unflustered. He paid for his drink and even insisted that the flight attendant keep the change. Once the plane landed, he released all the passengers and 2 flight attendants in exchange for the money and parachutes. The pilots, the flight engineer, and 1 flight attendant stayed on board. Cooper ordered them to fly to Mexico, but at minimum speed, with the landing gear and flaps deployed, at no more than 3,000 meters altitude, and, crucially, with the cabin depressurized. The Boeing took off into the night. It was pouring icy rain. 2 Air Force fighters followed the aircraft but lost visual contact in the darkness and clouds. Somewhere over the wild forests of Washington state, at 2013, a warning light in the cockpit indicated that the rear stairway was open. Cabin pressure dropped. When the plane landed in Reno for refueling, the cabin was empty. D.B. Cooper had vanished. Along with the money and parachutes, only his cheap tie with the pin was left on the seat. The FBI launched the largest manhunt in its history. They scoured the forests, dragged rivers, and checked thousands of suspects, but found very little. In 1980, a boy found a bundle of decaying $20 bills on the shore of the Columbia River, with serial numbers matching the ransom. Did Cooper survive? Jumping at night, in the rain, into the woods, dressed in a business suit and loafers with a training parachute that was unmanageable. The odds were slim, yet his body was never found. The exploits of Cooper, as he was mistakenly labeled by journalists, remain the only unresolved hijacking in American aviation history. Cooper stepped into the void and became a legend. But the hero of our next story stepped into the void to save himself and survived where it seemed physically impossible, drifting on debris from his ship among sharks, with only a watch that had stopped at the moment of the disaster. Story number 6. A cook who lived at the bottom of the ocean for 3 days. The Atlantic Ocean, off the coast of Nigeria, May 2013. The tugboat Jazzcon 4 was performing routine maintenance work on oil platforms. There were 12 people on board. Among them was 29-year-old cook Harrison Okene. At 4:30 in the morning, while most of the crew were asleep, a storm swept in. A colossal wave capsized the vessel. The tug began to sink rapidly. Harrison was in the restroom. This circumstance spared him from immediate death in his cabin, though not from terror. The ship turned upside down and sank to a depth of 30 meters. Water rushes filled the corridors. Harrison, clad only in his underwear, felt his way through the dark, hearing the screams of his coworkers that abruptly fell silent. He reached the officer's cabin and found an air pocket there. Imagine this. You are sitting in complete darkness, waist-deep in icy water. You know you are at the bottom of the ocean. Above you are 30 meters of water. The silence around you is grave-like, interrupted only by the creaks of metal and sounds that chill your blood. Harrison could hear fish consuming the bodies of his deceased friends in adjacent rooms. He remained there for 60 hours, nearly 3 days. He had no food. His only sustenance was a bottle of cola that he found floating in the water. The oxygen in his air pocket was slowly depleting, poisoning him with carbon dioxide. The frigid water was leaching life from his body. He prayed, reciting psalms, certain that he was going to die. On the third day, he heard a knocking sound. It was divers, sent not to rescue, but to recover the bodies of the deceased. They did not expect to find anyone alive. Harrison saw the light from a flashlight in the water. He reached out his hand and touched a diver. The diver recoiled in horror, thinking it was a body moving with the current, but the hand gripped his fingers. The diver's voice over the radio, trembling from shock, relayed the news to the support vessel. "He's alive. He's alive." The rescue was complicated. Harrison had spent far too long at that depth. If he had been brought up immediately, he would have succumbed to decompression sickness. His blood would have boiled from nitrogen. They placed a helmet on him, transferred him into a diving bell, and then he spent another 2 days in a decompression chamber on the surface. Harrison O'Kene became the sole survivor of the 12-member crew. Doctors described his survival in the air pocket at such depth for such duration as a physiological miracle. He never returned to the sea, changing his profession to a cook on land. Harrison survived trapped underwater, but the hero of our next story voluntarily confined himself in a trap of ice and snow, embarking on a solo trek to the pole to prove that a human being can survive on nothing but chocolate and faith in oneself. Story number 7. A doctor who journeyed alone to the North Pole. The Arctic. A white desert where the horizon merges with the sky and the compass goes haywire. On the 6th of March 1986, French doctor Jean-Louis Etienne stands at the edge of an icy field in northern Canada. Before him lies 1,000 kilometers of drifting ice leading to the North Pole. No one has ever reached the pole alone, without dogs and without external supply drops from aircraft. Etienne is 40 years old. He is not a professional polar explorer. He is a physician specializing in sports medicine and nutrition. His expedition is a scientific experiment on his own body and spirit. He pulls a sled weighing 50 kilograms, which contains a tent, sleeping bag, stove, and food. His diet is precisely calculated to the gram, but it is limited and specific. There is no meat. The foundation of his sustenance consists of freeze-dried products, nuts, and chocolate. Lots of chocolate. The first few days felt like hell. The sled would tip over on the pressure ridges, on ice piles as tall as a house. Etienne would fall, get up, and fall again. Temperatures plunged to minus 52 degrees. In such cold, metal becomes brittle and plastic crumbles. Sweat from his clothing froze, forming an icy shell. But the greatest enemy was not the cold, but the drift. The ice in the Arctic does not remain stationary. It is a giant conveyor driven by currents. Etienne was heading north, but the ice beneath his feet was drifting south. There were days when he covered 20 kilometers, exhausting himself. Yet, in the morning, after checking his coordinates with a sextant, he would find he was farther from the pole than the day before. It was a Sisyphean task in a frozen hell. He spoke to himself, he sang songs, and he gave names to his sleds. The solitude pressed on his psyche more than the frost. Hallucinations began to unfold in the white mist. He thought he saw cities on the horizon, or heard the voices of friends. Once he fell into a lead. It is the most terrifying nightmare for a polar explorer. The water instantly immobilizes movement. Etienne managed to escape, but he immediately had to set up his tent and dry his clothes, burning precious fuel, knowing that if he did not warm up within 30 minutes, he would be dead. He walked for 63 days. On the 11th of May 1986, Jean-Louis Etienne reached the North Pole. He became the first person in history to accomplish this journey alone on skis. He lost 10 kilograms. His face was blackened from frostbite and the sun, but he triumphed. Etienne proved that the limits of human endurance lie much farther than we think. However, the heroes of our next story expanded the boundaries not of endurance, but of luck. They survived a plane crash in the Andes, and to return home, they had to break the most severe taboo of humanity. Story number 8. Those who returned from the icy mountain. The Andes, 13th of October, 1972. A Uruguayan Air Force plane carrying a rugby team called Old Christians and their relatives was flying to Chile. Young, strong, full of life, the boys joked and tossed a ball in the aisle. In the clouds, the pilot made a fatal navigation error and began the descent too early. The plane crashed into an unnamed peak in the remote Andes at an altitude of 4,000 meters. The impact severed the wings and tail. The fuselage, like a giant sled, slid down the slope and buried itself in the snow. Out of about 40 people, 12 died instantly. 5 more succumbed to their injuries and the cold by morning. The survivors found themselves in a white hell. They had no warm clothes, only summer jackets and shirts. They were out of food, having only a little chocolate, wine, and crackers that they discovered in the luggage. All that surrounded them was snow and rocks. At night, temperatures dropped to -30. They waited for rescuers. On the 10th day, they found a small transistor radio and managed to intercept a signal. The news anchor announced that the search for the missing plane had been called off. They were presumed dead. This was a crucial moment. The world had turned its back on them. Now they were utterly alone. Hunger became unbearable. Their bodies began to consume themselves. The guys, accustomed to physical activity, grew weaker by the day. There were neither animals nor plants around, just snow and the aluminum of the fuselage, and the bodies of their deceased friends lying in the snow. They made a decision that could not be judged or even imagined while sitting in the warmth of a cozy chair. They entered into an agreement. If any of them died, the others could use their body to survive. It was a communion of flesh for the sake of life. They endured for 72 days. An avalanche descended upon them, burying the fuselage and claiming 8 more lives. They slept huddled together to keep warm. Eventually, the 2 strongest among them, Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa, decided to seek help. Without gear, maps, and in a state of exhaustion, they undertook an incredible trek across the high mountains. They traveled for 10 days. When they spotted a Chilean shepherd on the other side of a raging river, Parado threw a stone with a note wrapped around it. The note read, "I am from the plane that crashed in the mountains." On December 23rd, 14 emaciated skeletons were rescued. Their story shook the world. At first, they were condemned, labeled as cannibals. But as people learned the truth about what they had endured, the judgment transformed into admiration for their spirit's resilience. They survived due to their love for life and for one another. These individuals returned from the brink of death. However, the hero of our next story went in the opposite direction, or at least to its doorstep, to save thousands. He descended into the crater of an active volcano to collect gas samples, fully aware that he could be incinerated at any moment. This is the tale of a fire poet who ventured into the devil's throat. Belgian volcanologist Haroun Tazieff was a man deeply in love with the earth, but not the kind covered by green meadows and tranquil rivers, rather the kind that churns, erupts, and spews flames. He regarded volcanoes as living beings and dedicated his life to understanding their language. In 1948, he witnessed the first significant eruption of the Katura volcano in the Congo. Local residents fled in terror while he walked toward the lava flows. He approached so close that the heat singed his eyebrows. He stood there, captivated by the raw power of nature, and realized that mere observation was insufficient. He needed to look inside. His most audacious feat took place at the Nyiragongo volcano in Africa. Within the crater of this volcano lay a perpetual lake of bubbling lava. This phenomenon is rare and exceedingly dangerous. It is a gigantic cauldron of molten rock, with temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees. Tazieff resolved to descend to the first terrace within the crater to collect gas samples. No one had done this before him. He donned an asbestos suit resembling an astronaut's spacesuit and began his descent via a rope. The walls of the crater around him vibrated with a deafening roar. Toxic gases such as sulfur, chlorine, and carbon dioxide swirled in dense clouds. One breath without a gas mask could result in burned lungs. He descended to a depth of nearly 200 meters. He found himself in a realm where human laws did not apply. Below him, just a few dozen meters from his feet, molten magma churned violently. It erupted in fountains of liquid stone. The heat was so intense that even through his protective suit, his skin felt scorched. Taziev didn't just collect samples, he began filming. He had a motion picture camera with him. He captured the dance of flames from a vantage point unseen by any other human. He stood at the edge of a ledge while bombs fell around him, pieces of solidifying lava tumbling down. At one point, the wind shifted. A cloud of searing gas enveloped him. Visibility vanished. Breathing became laborious, even in the mask. Taziev realized that the trap had closed around him. He pulled the safety rope. The signal to hoist him up was sent. He was rescued, half alive, dehydrated, with burns in his lungs, yet feeling elated. His footage and findings revolutionized volcanology. Goryan Taziev demonstrated that volcanoes could be predicted, especially if one dared to get close. He saved countless lives by developing early warning systems based on the gas samples he collected, putting his life at risk. Taziev played with fire and won. However, the heroes of our next story confronted water, a vast expanse of water. They attempted to cross the Pacific Ocean on a raft made from balsa logs to prove a theory that had been ridiculed by historians worldwide. Story number 10. 6 brave souls on a raft from the past. The Pacific Ocean, April 28, 1947. In the port of Callao, Peru, a peculiar vessel was launched into the water. This was neither a ship, nor a yacht, nor even a boat. It was a raft made from 9 enormous balsa logs tied together with hemp ropes. No nails or pieces of metal were used. On the sail was painted the face of the sun god Kon-Tiki. Aboard were Norwegian anthropologist Thor Heyerdahl and 5 of his companions. Heyerdahl could not swim. He had a fear of water. Yet his belief in his theory outweighed his fear. Thor asserted that Polynesia was populated not from Asia, as all scholars believed, but from South America. The Indians could have crossed the ocean on rafts, he proclaimed. The professors laughed. Balsa logs will soak and sink within 2 weeks. You're doomed. Heyerdahl was determined to prove them wrong through action. They set sail into the open ocean, surrendering their fate to the currents of Humboldt and the trade winds. The initial weeks were a test. The raft creaked and groaned on the waves. The ropes dug into the wood. The crew anxiously monitored the buoyancy of the logs, but the scholars were mistaken. The resin-soaked balsa did not sink. The ropes did not wear down the wood. Instead, they embedded themselves into the soft lumber, reinforcing the structure. The ocean became their home. Flying fish leaped onto the deck each morning, providing breakfast. They caught tuna and dorado. Under the raft, great white sharks, gigantic creatures the size of buses, swam peacefully alongside, mistaking the raft for a sea monster. They weathered storms where the waves towered above the mast. They were repairing the steering raft, risking being swept overboard. They sent radio messages, and the world, holding its breath, monitored a point on the map. On the 101st day of their voyage, they spotted land. It was the atoll of Raroya in the Tuamotu archipelago. However, seeing land is one thing, and making landfall is another. The raft was heading straight for sharp coral reefs. This was the most perilous moment of the expedition. Giant waves hurled the multi-ton raft against the rocks. Heyerdahl ordered everyone to hold on to anything they could. A crash. The sound of splintering wood. Water enveloped them like a rocky tide. When the foam settled, they found themselves in a lagoon. The raft was damaged, but all 6 were alive. They had traveled 8,000 kilometers across open ocean using Stone Age technology. The Kon-Tiki expedition became a triumph of the human spirit. Heyerdahl proved that the ocean is not a barrier, but a pathway for ancient civilizations. His book became a bestseller, and the documentary won an Oscar. Heyerdahl crossed the ocean on logs, but the hero of our next story traversed the ocean on an even stranger vessel, a bathtub. Yes, a regular cast-iron bathtub equipped with an outboard motor, aiming to get into the Guinness Book of Records, only to encounter the storm of the century. Story number 11. The man who took a bath in the middle of the Atlantic. We usually think of sailors as tough men on sturdy ships, but history has examples where bravery borders on absurdity. Meet Major Phil Morrison, a retired British paratrooper. In 1968, he decided that swimming or sailing across the channel was too mundane. He went to a plumbing store, bought a regular cast-iron bathtub, attached an outboard motor to it, named it Matilda, and swam across the channel. But that was just the beginning. In the early 80s, when the world was going crazy for records, a man emerged who aimed to surpass them all. His name was Tom McLean. A former SAS soldier, a man of steel, he single-handedly rowed across the Atlantic in a rowing boat. But that wasn't enough for him. He wanted to do something that would make the world laugh and marvel at the same time. Tom decided to cross the Atlantic in a bottle. He constructed a vessel that resembled a gigantic beer bottle from Tiffin Ale. It measured 11 meters in length. Inside was cramped, hot, and even calm waters would make him feel seasick. The bottle's shape made the vessel extremely unstable. In a side wave, it rolled like a log. In 1990, Tom McLean departed from New York. His destination was Falmouth in England. This journey was torture. The bottle didn't cut through the waves. It crashed into them. Tom was perpetually soaked in wet clothes. Inside the hull there was a cacophony, amplified by the boat's shape. He had to tie himself to his bunk to avoid being tossed around the cabin. During a storm one night, a hurricane struck him. The bottle capsized. Tom found himself inside a gigantic maraca, flying upside down in the black abyss of the ocean. But thanks to a shifted center of gravity, the heavy keel caused the vessel, like a weeble, to right itself again. Tom lost communication. His fresh food supplies ran out. He survived on canned goods and drank desalinated water. He even talked to seagulls. After 37 days of solitude and a workout that could make an astronaut nauseous, a yellow bottle entered the harbor of Falmouth. Tom McLean stepped onto the shore, swaying but smiling. He became the only individual in history to cross the ocean in a vessel meant for a giant's tea party. This person transformed absurdity into a feat. But the hero of our next story accomplished an act that was long considered a crime. He saved 669 children from Nazi death camps by organizing trains of life and remained silent about it for 50 years. This is story number 12, The Stockbroker Who Outwitted the Gestapo. London, December 1938. Nicholas Winton, a 29-year-old stockbroker, was about to set off to Switzerland for a skiing trip. He had already packed his bags when a friend from Prague called. "Cancel the skiing trip and come here. I need your help." The situation was dire. Winton arrived in Prague and witnessed horror. The Sudetenland had already been annexed by Nazi Germany. Thousands of refugees, mostly Jews, were living in camps under inhumane conditions, awaiting the inevitable invasion of Hitler into the rest of Czechoslovakia. The world turned a blind eye, but Winton could not. He realized that saving adults was not feasible. Countries refused to accept the refugees. However, Britain agreed to accept children under 17, provided that a deposit of £50 was paid for each child and a foster family was found. Winton turned his hotel room at the Europa into headquarters. During the day, he worked on the stock exchange, and at night, he wrote hundreds of letters pleading with unknown Britons to take in Czech children. He forged visas, bribed officials, and negotiated with conductors. The Gestapo kept a close watch on him. He risked his life every day while in Prague. The first train with children departed on the 14th of March 1939, just a day before German tanks rolled into Prague. Over the next 5 months, Winton organized 7 more trains. It was a race against time and death. Parents pushed their crying children through the windows of the train cars, knowing they were seeing them for the last time. Tags with numbers hung around the little ones' necks. The largest convoy was scheduled to leave on the 1st of September 1939, carrying 250 children. But that morning, World War II began. The borders closed and the train did not depart. Almost all those left behind perished in concentration camps. This became Winton's deepest sorrow for the rest of his life. Yet, 669 children were saved. They grew up in Britain and became doctors, scientists, politicians, and directors. Among them was Karl Reiss, director of The French Lieutenant's Woman. The most astonishing aspect of this story is its silence. After the war, Nicholas Winton never spoke of his heroic deed. Even his wife Greta was unaware of it. The secret was only unveiled in 1988. 50 years later, Greta discovered an old album in the attic filled with photographs of the children, lists of names, and letters. She asked her husband about it. Nicholas simply shrugged, saying it was what he did before the war. Greta handed the album to journalists, and Winton was invited to the BBC talk show That's Life. He sat in the front row, thinking he was merely an audience member. The host opened the album and began to read. "There is someone in this audience whose name is on this list. Vera Gissing. Please stand up." The woman sitting next to Nicholas Winton got up and embraced him. Then the host asked, "Is there anyone else in this room who owes their life to Nicholas Winton?" At that moment, the entire audience rose to their feet. Dozens of people, many with tears streaming down their faces. These were the very children, Winton's children. Nicholas Winton, the man who saved the generation, quietly wept, wiping his eyes with his fingers. He lived to be 106 years old, leaving behind not only memories, but also 6,000 descendants, individuals he saved. Winton rescued children from war. However, the hero of our next story escaped war himself, surviving for 100 days in the bell tower of a cathedral, feeding on pigeons and rainwater while battles raged below for his town. Story number 13. The Man Who Lived Above the War. Italy, the town of Cassino, 1944. Below, one of the bloodiest battles of World War II is raging. The Allies are storming the Gustav Line. The Germans defend with fanatical determination. The town has been reduced to ruins. Only dust and stones remain of the famous Monte Cassino monastery. Yet amidst this hell, there is a spot untouched by death, the crumbling bell tower of St. John's Church. There, on a tiny platform beneath the bell, a man hides. His name is Antonio. Antonio is not a soldier. He is a local fool, the town's madman whom everyone pitied and fed before the war. When the bombings began, all the residents fled or perished. In panic, Antonio climbed to the highest place he knew, the bell tower. An explosion destroyed the staircase leading down. Antonio found himself trapped 30 meters high. Below, tanks rolled through the streets, and explosions rang out. Soldiers were fighting each other in hand-to-hand combat. However, up above, in his stone nest, Antonio lived his odd life. He became the ghost of Cassino. Snipers from both sides noticed movement in the tower but refrained from shooting. At first they thought he was a lookout, but Antonio's behavior was too peculiar. He waved his arms at the birds, danced to the thundering artillery, and curled up on the edge of the abyss to sleep. Soldiers, exhausted by the war, began to regard him as a kind of talisman, the spirit of this dead town. The problem was food. Antonio had no supplies, but he had neighbors, the pigeons that also took refuge in the bell tower. Antonio caught them with his bare hands. He drank rainwater that collected in the crevices of the old stones. He survived there for 105 days. When the Allies finally captured the town and Polish soldiers raised a flag over the ruins of the monastery, they heard a faint cry from above. Engineers fashioned a rope ladder and rescued Antonio. He was emaciated, dirty, and bearded, but alive, and he smiled. In his pockets, they found a collection of shrapnel shards that he had gathered as treasures. For him, the war was merely a very loud storm that he needed to wait out. Antonio, a man whom the world deemed mad, turned out to be the wisest of all. He discovered the sole way to survive where tens of thousands of ordinary people perished. Antonio survived due to his height, while the heroes of our next story survived through depth and darkness. They were miners, trapped underground for 2 weeks, consuming coal dust to deceive their hunger, as rescuers drilled through the rock blindly. Story number 14. A Miracle in Lenge, or a Call from the Beyond. Germany, the 24th of October 1963, an iron ore mine in Lenge. An ordinary evening shift. 129 miners are underground, extracting ore for the German economic miracle. At 8 o'clock, a disaster occurred that every miner fears. The sedimentation pond broke. 500,000 cubic meters of icy sludge, mixed with mud and stones, rushed into the mine shafts. The force of the flow was so great that it tore away steel beams and flattened mine carts. 79 individuals managed to ascend to the surface during the first hours. The others were trapped. The rescue operation commenced immediately, but hope dwindled with each passing hour. A week later, on the 1st of November, the mine administration announced mourning ceremonies. It was officially declared that there were no survivors underground. The ventilation system was non-operational, and the water had flooded all known cavities. However, in a dead zone, in a small air pocket at a depth of 60 meters, 21 individuals were sitting. They were surrounded by complete darkness. The water was rising to their throats, and the air was becoming scarce. They had no food. They chewed on leather belts and licked the condensation from the walls. To keep from going mad, they sang hymns and took turns telling stories of what they would eat for dinner once they were rescued. On the 3rd of November, 10 days after the accident, 3 miners decided to take a desperate step. They plunged into the icy water, attempting to swim through the flooded tunnel to freedom. They did not return. 11 remained. On the surface, defying logic and orders to cease operations, a group of engineers decided to drill one last exploratory borehole in a location referred to as the Old Man, an abandoned site. The odds of finding anyone there were 1 in a million. The drill penetrated the rock and fell into an abyss. The engineers lowered a microphone, and suddenly, through static interference, a tapping sound emerged from the speakers. Tap, tap, tap. Then a faint voice. "There are 11 of us here. We are alive. Help us." Germany held its breath. This was dubbed a miracle in Lenga. Chancellor Ludwig Erhard interrupted government proceedings. The entire nation gathered around their televisions. The rescue operation was incredibly challenging. The borehole was too narrow for a person to fit through. It needed to be widened without collapsing the cave ceiling where the individuals were trapped. Food, warm clothing, and letters from loved ones were sent down through the narrow pipe. On the 7th of November, 2 weeks after the disaster, the first survivor was brought to the surface. The last, the 11th, was a 50-year-old electrician. When he saw the sky, he fell to his knees and wept. These individuals had returned from a grave that had been dug for them by bureaucracy. But the story we will uncover next is about a man who buried himself alive with a bottle of vodka and woke up in a morgue to throw the most joyful party of his life. Story number 15. The dead man who froze to death to stay warm. Poland, the city of Kamienna Góra. Winter, 1995. The frost is so intense that birds freeze mid-flight. A local resident, 56-year-old Mr. Tadeusz, known in the town for his fondness for strong drinks, is returning home from a party. The journey is not short, and Mr. Tadeusz feels warm enough inside to consider a snowdrift a cozy bed. He decides to take a seat on a bench in the park to rest and falls asleep. In the morning, passers-by discover him. Pan Tadeusz is not breathing, and there is no pulse. His body is cold and stiff as a rock. Paramedics declare death by hypothermia. The body is taken to the morgue. The pathologist, weary from his shift, completes the paperwork, attaches a tag to Mr. Tadeusz's finger, and places him in the cold storage, postponing the autopsy until the following day. Several hours pass. In the morgue, there is silence, and suddenly the custodian, making his rounds, hears strange noises coming from the refrigerator. Knocks, followed by muffled cries and, bizarrely, singing. Someone inside is singing Polish folk songs. The custodian is not a timid man, but he is superstitious. He crosses himself and, with trembling hands, opens the heavy door of the chamber. From within, wrapped in a sheet, steps out a blue from cold, shivering, yet alive Pan Tadeusz. "Kurwa, where am I?" he asks, chattering his teeth. "And why is it so cold in here?" "Give me a blanket." It turns out that the alcohol in Tadeusz's blood acted like antifreeze. He had slipped into a state of profound cryostasis. His heart rate had slowed down to just a few beats per minute. His breathing became shallow. The doctors assumed he was dead. However, in the relative warmth of the morgue compared to outside, and within the refrigerator, which was warmer than a snowdrift, his body began to thaw. The most amusing part of the story is what Mr. Tadeusz did after his resurrection. He declined hospitalization. He got dressed, gathered his belongings, including the half-finished bottle he found in his pocket, and headed back to the same party he left the night before. Friends, who had already begun to mourn him, were nearly struck by a heart attack upon seeing Tadeusz at the doorstep. Tadeusz sat down at the table, poured himself a shot, and said, "Well, to health. I was there. It's cold and dull. Better here." Mr. Tadeusz cheated death thanks to vodka, but the hero of our next story survived thanks to a watch. He was the only person who missed two of the deadliest flights in history, simply because he loved to take his time packing his luggage. Story number 16. The man who was late for his date with death. Imagine a man waking up with a heavy feeling of annoyance. He glances at the alarm clock that didn't ring, at the open suitcase, and realizes he has run out of time. A taxi is caught in a traffic jam, check-in is closed, and the plane he was supposed to be on is already taking off, leaving him in the stuffy airport terminal. At that moment, he curses his sluggishness and fate. He doesn't yet know that in an hour he will be on his knees thanking the heavens for every lost minute. Martin de Jong is a professional cyclist from the Netherlands. His life is a constant series of flights, competitions, and a tight schedule. But in 2014, his personal guardian angel seems to have worked overtime, achieving the impossible twice within 4 months. On July 17, 2014, Martin was supposed to fly from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur. This was flight MH19 of Malaysia Airlines. The athlete was just about to purchase his ticket, but at the last moment, literally just hours before takeoff, he stumbled upon another offer. Another flight with a layover cost €300 less. Being a thrifty Dutchman, Martin thought, "Why pay more? I'll take another path." He returned his ticket for flight Chai 17. A few hours after takeoff, that plane was shot down over Ukraine, claiming the lives of all 298 people on board. Martin watched the news at the airport, clutching his cheap ticket, unable to utter a word. Any other person, after such an incident, would have never set foot on a plane again. However, Martin was an athlete, and his contracts required him to be on the other side of the world. March 8, 2014. Yes, we rewind time to grasp the extent of the mystique. Flight MX370. The same missing Boeing that became the greatest mystery of the century. Martin de Jong was supposed to be on that flight. He stood at the check-in desk in Kuala Lumpur, but a technical delay with his luggage or documents caused him to hesitate. He was delayed by merely 10 minutes. The doors of the airplane closed right before him. The aircraft took off without him. An hour later, MH0 vanished from radar forever, disappearing into the boundless waters of the Indian Ocean. 239 people went missing. Martin de Jong purchased tickets for ghost flights twice in 1 year. Twice, he was meant to turn into ash or vanish into nothingness. He was saved by €300 and a 10-minute delay. When journalists surrounded him, seeking to understand the secret of his luck, he simply replied, "I'm just a lucky guy who doesn't like to hurry." This man outsmarted aviation statistics and death itself merely by slowing down. But the heroine of our next story survived not by being slow, but by becoming invisible. She spent several years in a hidden room no larger than a doghouse, hiding from an entire army, and her only form of entertainment was a crack in the wall through which she could see the legs of her enemies. Story number 17. A prisoner in her own home who became invisible. Poland, the city of Przemysl, 1942. The Holocaust rages across Europe. Jewish families are disappearing into ghettos and camps. 13-year-old Stefania Podgorska, a Catholic, is left alone with her 6-year-old sister Helenka after her father's death and the deportation of her mother and brother to forced labor in Germany. Stefania lives in a large house, but this house is not a fortress. It is a trap. In the attic, she hides 13 Jews, friends of her family, neighbors, and children. If the Germans find them, they will all be shot on the spot, including Stefania and Helenka. The situation becomes critical when the German command decides to requisition Stefania's house for military purposes. Wehrmacht officers and 2 nurses settle into the rooms on the first floor. Imagine this horror. On the first floor, Nazis live, eating, laughing, cleaning their weapons, while directly above their heads, in complete silence, sit 13 doomed people in the attic. Stefania is a teenager, carrying the weight of 15 lives. She must feed them, dispose of waste, and ensure that not a single floorboard creaks. She works at a factory to earn money for food, buying supplies on the black market from various parts of the city to avoid drawing suspicion by carrying too much bread. The most terrifying moment arrived when the German officer decided to inspect the attic. Stefania stood below, her heart pounding so loudly that it seemed to drown out the soldier's footsteps. The Jews in the attic froze in fear. One of them, Joseph, held a vial of poison in his hands, ready to take his own life along with his family's to avoid falling into the hands of the Gestapo alive. The officer climbed a few steps, but the attic was cluttered with old junk and shrouded in darkness. "Only rats here," he grumbled, and descended once more. Stefania and 13 ghosts lived like this from 2 to 12 years old. They endured the winter without heating, suffered through illnesses without medical care, and constantly faced the maddening fear of being discovered, merely by the sound of their breathing. On the 27th of July, 1944, Soviet troops entered Przemysl. The 13 descended from the attic. They were emaciated, pallid, but alive. Stefania Podgorska, the girl who became a mother to adult men and women, later married one of those she saved, Joseph Brzezinski. She proved that courage is not determined by age or weaponry. Sometimes, courage is simply the ability to remain silent and carry bread right under the enemy's nose. Stefania concealed people in the attic, but the hero of our next story hid in an even more unusual place. He lived for 18 years in the terminal of Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport, becoming a man without a homeland, without papers, yet with his red sofa and worldwide fame. Story number 18. A citizen of nowhere, king of Terminal 1. Paris, Charles de Gaulle Airport, August 1988. Mihran Karimi, from Syria, an Iranian refugee expelled from his country for protesting against the Shah, arrived in France. His goal was the United Kingdom, where he hoped to find his mother. However, during his journey, his bag containing his documents was stolen. Without a passport, he could not enter London. The British authorities put him on a return flight to Paris. Yet without documents, he could also not enter France. Mihran found himself in a legal black hole. He was in the transit zone of Terminal 1. This was neutral territory. Formally, he was no longer on the airplane, but still not in France. The police could not arrest him since he had entered legally, but they also couldn't let him into the city. They told him, "Wait while they figure this out." He took a seat on a red plastic bench near a pizzeria and remained there for 18 years. Mihran, whom the staff nicknamed Sir Alfred, transformed a few square meters of the terminal into his home. He slept on the bench, washed himself in the public restroom before the first passengers arrived, always impeccably clean and shaven, and was fed with meal vouchers given to him by the airport employees. His days followed a routine. He read newspapers, kept a diary consisting of thousands of pages, and observed the flow of people. Millions of passengers passed by him. Fashion, presidents, currencies changed. The franc gave way to the euro, while Sir Alfred remained a constant in the terminal. He became a local fixture. Airport doctors monitored his health. Cleaners did not disturb his boxes of belongings. Lawyers fought for his status for years. The most astonishing event occurred in 1999. Belgium and France finally agreed to grant him refugee documents. The lawyer rushed to him with uplifting news. "Alfred, you are free. You can leave." However, Macron declined to sign the documents. After years of isolation, his psyche had transformed. The terminal became his universe, his safe haven. The outside world intimidated him. He declared that he was not Iranian Macron in Syria, but British subject Sir Alfred, demanding paperwork to validate this fictional identity. He resided in the airport until 2006, when he was hospitalized due to illness. It was only then, on a stretcher, that he exited the terminal for the first time in 18 years. Steven Spielberg acquired the rights to his story for $250,000, and created the film The Terminal featuring Tom Hanks. In the movie, the character finds love and a way out. In reality, the Iranian man, having received the money, was unable to adjust to life. He lived in shelters and in 2021 returned to the very same Charles de Gaulle airport where he passed away on the bench that was his only home. A man who became a prisoner of the freedom to move. But the hero of our next story became a prisoner of speed. He survived a crash in a racing car that fell apart at a speed of 300 kilometers per hour, and upon regaining consciousness, the first thing he asked was if he had won the race. Story number 19. The driver who was severed in half but continued to race. Donington Park Circuit, United Kingdom, April 1990. Formula 3 qualifications are underway. Young British driver Martin Donnelly sits behind the wheel of his yellow Lotus. He is talented, ambitious, and dreams of Formula 1. At one of the track's fastest corners, the suspension of his car fails. The car, hurtling at 270 kilometers per hour, becomes an uncontrollable projectile. It crashes head-on into a concrete barrier. The impact was so forceful that the carbon fiber monocoque, the safety capsule designed to protect the driver, splintered like a paper bag. The car effectively disintegrated. The engine went one way, the wheels another, and Martin Donnelly was thrown directly onto the asphalt. The scene that greeted the marshals and doctors was horrific. The driver lay in the middle of the track, strapped to a fragment of his seat. His body was twisted in an unnatural position, resembling a rag doll. One leg was turned backward. The helmet was cracked. He was not breathing. His face began to turn blue. Professor Sid Watkins, the chief doctor of Formula 1, arrived on the scene within 30 seconds. He saw that Donnelly was dying. He initiated resuscitation right on the asphalt, amidst a puddle of fuel and blood. Sid manually opened the driver's airway and restarted his heart. Martin had multiple fractures of the skull, legs, pelvis, a collapsed lung, and internal bleeding. The doctors at the hospital gave him 0 chances of survival. They didn't even proceed to operate on his legs immediately, believing he would die from his brain injuries. But Martin Donnelly refused to give up. He remained in a coma for 7 weeks. His body was rebuilt like a construction set. The doctors used titanium plates, pins, and screws. After 3 months, he awoke. The first thing he asked upon seeing Sid Watkins was, "When can I get back behind the wheel?" The doctors told him that he would never walk again. Martin learned to walk, despite having a severe limp. They told him he would never drive a racing car. 3 years later, Martin Donnelly returned to the track. Of course, his Formula 1 career was over before it even started, but he became a successful team manager and mentor to young drivers. The image of his body lying on the track remains one of the most shocking in motorsport history. Yet Martin looks back at it with a smile. It was a bad day at the office, but I'm still here. Donnelly survived after hitting the concrete, but the hero of our next story survived a plunge into water from a height of 75 meters. He jumped from the Golden Gate Bridge, not for fame, but with the intention of ending his life. Yet the water refused to accept him. This is story number 20. A second of regret, lasting 70 meters. San Francisco, Golden Gate Bridge. On September 25, 2000, Kevin Hines was 19 years old. He struggled with severe depression and bipolar disorder. The voices in his head convinced him that he was unneeded, a burden, and that the only way out was to step off the edge. He boarded a bus, crying the whole way, hoping someone would ask, "Hey, are you okay?" If just one person had acknowledged him, he wouldn't have done it, but people turned away. On the bridge, a tourist asked him to take her photo, but she did not notice the tears on his face. Kevin approached the railing, 75 meters to the water below. The speed of his fall was 120 kilometers per hour. Hitting the water from such a height is akin to crashing into a concrete wall. The survival rate is less than 1%. He climbed over the railing and pushed off. In the very moment his hands left the metal, he had a thought that nearly all suicide survivors experience. I want to live. All the problems that seemed insurmountable a second ago suddenly appeared trivial and solvable. Everything, except for one. He was already in free fall. During the 4 seconds of his descent, Kevin managed to gather himself. He realized that if he landed flat, he would be torn apart. He pointed his legs down, trying to enter the water like a soldier diving. The impact was monstrous. He broke 2 vertebrae, but they did not sever his spinal cord. The fragments stopped mere millimeters from the nerves. His lungs were battered. He could not breathe. Kevin sank deeply underwater. The instinct to survive, which had awakened during the fall, compelled him to paddle towards the surface. Despite the excruciating pain in his back, he broke through, gasping for air. But then a new threat emerged. The current beneath the Golden Gate Bridge was powerful, and the water was icy. Kevin began to drown. And then something happened that skeptics would label a coincidence, while believers would call it a miracle. Kevin felt something large and slippery pushing him from below. He thought, "A shark. I survived the fall just to be eaten by a shark." But it was not a shark. It was a sea lion. The animal swam in circles beneath him, nudging him to the surface, keeping his head above water until a Coast Guard boat arrived. Kevin Hines became one of 36 people to survive a jump from this bridge, out of thousands who did not. Today, he is a renowned speaker and advocate for suicide prevention. He shares his story to convey a simple message. The moment you let go of the railing is the moment you realize you have made a mistake. Don't test this on yourself. Kevin survived thanks to a sea lion, but the heroes of our next story survived due to beer. Yes, quite literally. During an earthquake, they found themselves trapped under the rubble of a bar and drank whatever they had at hand to avoid dying of thirst. This is story number 21, the bar counter that became an ark. Mexico City, 19th of September, 1985. Morning. The city awakens. People hurry to work. At 7:19, the ground trembles. An earthquake measuring 8.1 on the Richter scale turns the city center to dust. High-rise buildings collapse like accordions. Hospitals, hotels, and residential buildings come crashing down in seconds. Among the debris, 3 survivors find themselves trapped under tons of concrete, resting in an air pocket. They were either employees of a small bar or perhaps night owls who stayed out until morning. History remembers their names, but what matters more are the circumstances. They were ensnared in complete darkness. Air was scarce, but enough to breathe. The main issue was thirst. Mexico is a hot city, and in the confined space beneath the rubble, the temperature quickly rose. There was no water, the pipes were broken. Yet, fate, whether by chance or irony, placed them in the storeroom of the bar. Miraculously, boxes of beer and wine stood around them, untouched. Normally, alcohol dehydrates the body. Doctors would say that drinking in such a situation is tantamount to suicide. However, these individuals had no choice. They could either drink this or perish from dehydration. After 3 days, they had spent 9 days under the ruins. For 9 days, their sustenance was solely the liquid from the bottles. They drank beer to gain some calories and moisture. They joked that this was the longest party of their lives, although in reality, they were teetering on the edge of madness from fear, pain, and drunkenness in the dark. When rescuers, who had already lost hope of finding anyone alive, heard the tapping and reached them, they were met with a strong smell of alcohol. The 3 survivors were exhausted and dehydrated. While alcohol is certainly a poor substitute for water, they were still alive. Their rescue became a symbol of the vitality of the Mexican spirit. Newspapers proclaimed, "Mexico cannot be destroyed as long as there is tequila and hope." Doctors later acknowledged that perhaps the sugar and calories in the drinks, along with the sedative effect of alcohol, helped them panic less and use less oxygen, playing a role in their survival. These individuals drank to life in the darkness. However, the hero of our next story drank only seawater and turtle blood. He spent not just 9 days, or even 100, but 438 days in the ocean. This is the story of José Salvador Alvarenga, a man who unintentionally sailed across the Pacific Ocean. Story number 22. A man who became one with the ocean. Mexico. The coast of Chiapas, 17th of November, 2012. 36-year-old fisherman José Salvador Alvarenga and his 22-year-old partner, Ezequiel Cordoba, set out to sea on a 7-meter fiberglass boat. They planned to fish for 30 hours and return with a plentiful catch. Suddenly, a storm, which meteorologists labeled El Norte, hit them. The engine stalled, the radio failed, and the boat was tossed about like a splinter in the open ocean. For 5 days they battled the elements, scooping water out with their hands. When the storm finally subsided, they found themselves hundreds of kilometers from the shore. They were adrift. Their supply of food had turned into a diet reminiscent of early humans. They caught fish with their bare hands as it sought refuge under the boat from the sun. They also managed to capture seabirds that landed to rest on the deck, as well as turtles. The greatest challenge they faced was the scarcity of fresh water. When it rained, they collected it in the turtles' shells. During dry spells, Alvarenga resorted to drinking turtle blood and his own urine. His young companion couldn't endure the harsh conditions. Esel refused to consume raw fish and birds. His body weakened, he fell into despair, and after 4 months, he succumbed to starvation. Before he died, he made Alvarenga promise not to touch his body and to find his mother to tell her what had happened. Alvarenga spent 6 days conversing with his friend's corpse, unable to accept the reality of his death, until he finally buried him at sea. Left alone, the loneliness proved to be more terrifying than hunger. Alvarenga invented imaginary friends, sang songs, and told jokes to himself. He watched the stars, the whales, and the sharks that brushed against the boat. He had become a part of this world, a man turned plankton. He drifted for 438 days. On the 30th of January 2014, he spotted a green strip on the horizon. It was Ibon Atoll, part of the Marshall Islands. His boat was washed ashore. Haze, now unkempt with long hair and a beard resembling that of a wild man, stepped onto solid ground. He had traveled 10,500 kilometers. Initially, the locals did not believe him, but verification of the currents and timelines confirmed his tale. Hayes Salvador Alvarenga established an absolute record for survival in solitary drifting in modern history. Not only did he survive, but he also adapted. Alvarenga became integrated with nature. However, the hero of our next story took a different path, dominating nature with his will. He planted a forest in the desert all by himself over the span of 40 years, using only buckets of water and incredible determination. Story number 23. The Man Who Planted a Forest in the Desert. India, Assam, 1979. A 16-year-old boy named Jadav Payeng stands in the midst of a barren wasteland by the banks of the Brahmaputra River. After a severe flood, the water receded, leaving behind dead land littered with sun-dried snake carcasses. The sight struck Jadav to his core. He asked the village elders, "What should I do?" They provided him with a few bamboo saplings and said, "Plant them, perhaps something will grow." Jadav did something much greater. He decided to revive the land. Every single day for the next 40 years, Jadav Payeng planted trees alone. Initially, he planted bamboo, followed by larger trees. He had no machinery. He carried water from the river in clay pots. He brought red ants from his village to enrich the soil. He fertilized the ground with buffalo dung. At first they laughed at him. A forest madman, they called him in the village. But Jadav paid no heed. He simply kept planting. The trees began to grow. Grass emerged, leading to the arrival of insects, followed by birds. Soon deer, rabbits, and wild boars appeared. In 30 years, a once barren sandy spit transformed into a true forest, spanning 550 hectares. This area exceeds the size of Central Park in New York City. The forest welcomed back tigers and rhinoceroses. A herd of 100 elephants began visiting for several months each year. The world was unaware of this subspecies until 2008, when a nature photographer stumbled upon the forest by chance. He couldn't believe his eyes. The map indicated a desert here. Local residents pointed him to a man in plain clothing living in a hut at the forest's edge. This was Jadav Payeng, who cultivated a forest that became a home for hundreds of species of animals, altered microclimates, and saved the island from erosion. When asked why he did it, he replied, "I simply planted trees so that animals would have a home. If we do not take care of nature, who will?" Jadav Payeng, the forest man of India, demonstrated that an individual with a bucket of water and a dream can accomplish more than entire governments with their multi-million-dollar programs. Jadav created an ecosystem, but the heroine of our next story survived by becoming part of a foreign ecosystem. She was a little girl who got lost in the woods and was adopted by a troop of monkeys. Story number 24. The Girl Raised by Monkeys, Colombia. Somewhere in the jungle around 1954, a 4-year-old girl plays near her home. Suddenly, she is seized by strangers, an abduction, but something goes wrong. Perhaps the kidnappers were frightened of a pursuit. They toss the child deep into the dense tropical forest and vanish. The girl is alone. She doesn't know how to survive. She cries out for her mother, but only the sounds of birds and the roars of monkeys reply. Days pass and hunger becomes unbearable. The girl sees a troop of capuchin monkeys eating bananas that have fallen from the trees. She tries to approach them, but the monkeys hiss and chase her away. So she simply mimics them. She forages for the same fruits and roots as they do. Thus begins her new life. She spends 5 years in the jungle. Gradually, the troop accepts her. She learns to climb trees, though not as nimbly as the monkeys. She sleeps in hollows. She learns to understand their sounds, a warning cry, a call for food. The monkeys cared for her, grooming her hair for insects, just as they would with their young. One day, she eats a poisonous fruit. A terrible pain grips her stomach, and she lies on the ground, dying. An old monkey, whom she names Grandpa, approaches, grabs her by the scruff, and drags her to a stream. He immerses her in the water time and again, making her vomit the poison. The monkey saves her life. She forgot human speech. She walked on all fours. Her hands and feet grew calloused. She became part of the monkey tribe. Her odyssey concluded as suddenly as it began. Hunters found her, but they didn't rescue her. Instead, they sold her to a brothel in the city of Cucuta. There, the girl and the wild child were kept in a cage like animals. She managed to escape. She lived on the streets, stealing, until a kind family took her in. They named her Marina. They taught her to speak and walk upright again. Later, she moved to England, got married, and had children. For many years, she kept her past a secret, fearing that others would think she was insane. However, one day she shared everything with her daughters. They encouraged her to write a book. Researchers who examined her experiences confirmed her knowledge of capuchin behavior, her physiology, her memories, all point to an extraordinary tale. Indeed, Marina Chapman is one of the few documented cases of a Mowgli child who managed to reintegrate into human society completely. Marina survived by becoming part of a pack. Yet, the hero of our next story survived because he refused to conform to the herd. He was a prisoner of war who escaped from a Soviet gulag in Siberia and walked 6,500 kilometers to India. Story number 25. The Man Who Walked Home Across Half the World. Siberia, Gulag, 1941. Polish officer Sławomir Rawicz, arrested by the NKVD, sits in a frozen barrack. Outside, the temperature is -40 degrees, and the taiga stretches endlessly. He is 25 years old and sentenced to 25 years of hard labor. For most, this is a death sentence, but Rawicz and 6 other prisoners, a mix of Poles, Lithuanians, and 1 American, decide to attempt the impossible. They plan an escape. One night, during a snowstorm, they cut a hole in the wire fence and venture into the wilderness. They have no maps, no food except for a few pieces of bread, and no weapons apart from a homemade knife. Their target is India, 6,500 kilometers to the south. They travel by night, hiding from patrols, foraging for berries, mushrooms, and catching snakes. They cross the frozen expanse of Lake Baikal, 100 kilometers across fragile ice, under a biting wind that knocks them off their feet. They reach Mongolia, but rather than finding safety, they encounter the new desert of Gobi. This is the most harrowing part of their journey. During the day, the sun beats down with relentless heat, while nights bring bone-chilling cold. Water is scarce. They suffer from thirst and hallucinations. 2 members of the group perish. The survivors press on. They traverse Tibet and the Himalayas, climbing over snow-covered passes at 5,000 meters in summer clothing, battling altitude sickness. In March of 1942, after 11 months of wandering, 4 ragged, gaunt figures resembling ghosts descend from the mountains and stumble upon a Gurkha patrol in India, then a British colony. Slawomir Ravich and 3 of his companions have survived. Their story, recounted in the book The Long Walk, has become a symbol of unimaginable willpower for freedom. Although debates later arose regarding the authenticity of the details in Ravich's book, or whether he recounted the stories of other escapees, one fact remains: such a journey was made. People traversed 3 of the planet's harshest geographical zones, driven solely by hope. While Rawitz and his companions trekked south, the heroine of our next story headed north, into the heart of Alaska, to build a home in the wilderness and live there for 30 years in complete solitude, becoming a legend of the American frontier. Story number 26, The Woman Who Became the Queen of the Wilderness. Alaska, 1968. Richard Prenicky, a 52-year-old retired mechanic, decides to fulfill his lifelong dream. He finds a secluded lake in the mountains, which he names Twin Lakes, and builds a log cabin there, all by himself, using only hand tools. He lived there for 30 years. His existence was a hymn to simplicity and self-sufficiency. He hunted, fished, and grew vegetables during the brief Alaskan summer. He kept meticulous journals and captured his life on 16mm film. These recordings would later transform into the acclaimed film Alone in the Wilderness. Richard Prenicky was not a hermit or a misanthrope. He cherished nature as a living entity. He observed grizzly bears, wolverines, and wolves, not as prey, but as neighbors. He was well acquainted with every bird and tree. His cabin, constructed with remarkable precision and craftsmanship, still stands as a monument to human ingenuity. He demonstrated that a person could live in harmony with nature, not by destroying it, but by becoming a part of it. Yet, Richard Prenicky's story would be incomplete without mentioning another legend, that of Ada Blackjack, a woman whose tale is reminiscent of a fairy tale. In 1921, this young Eskimo seamstress found herself in dire need of money to treat her sick son. She agreed to join an Arctic expedition to the uninhabited Wrangel Island as a cook and seamstress. The expedition, consisting of 5 members, aimed to claim the island for the British Empire, but things took a turn for the worse. The ship meant to rescue them a year later failed to break through the ice. Food supplies dwindled. One of the members fell ill with scurvy. 3 of the strongest men set out on foot across the ice for help on a 700-mile trek. They were never seen again. Left on the island were 2, Ada and the ailing, irritable scientist Lorne Knight. Ada, who had never hunted in her life and was terrified of guns, now had to take care of him. She learned to set snares for Arctic foxes, shoot seals, and ward off polar bears from their camp. When Knight died, Ada was left alone. For 2 years, she survived on the frozen island. Her only companion was the expedition's cat, named Vic. She built boats from skins, repaired guns, and maintained a journal. This small, fragile woman, once deemed useless by the male explorers, turned out to be the strongest of them all. In 1923, she was rescued by a ship, and Ada Blackjack, the Arctic Robinson Crusoe, returned as a heroine. But fame did not interest her. She took her earnings and healed her son. Both Prenicky and Blackjack, each in their unique way, illustrated that Alaska is not merely a frigid wilderness. It is a place that reveals the true essence of humanity. They survived in the wild, but the hero of our next story endured in a world where nature was replaced by numbers. He was a hacker who penetrated the Pentagon using a computer the size of a wardrobe and nearly sparked a Third World War. While now, there are traces of UFOs. This is the story number 27, the hacker who sought aliens in the Pentagon's computers. London, at the beginning of the 2000th decade. Gary McKinnon, an unemployed system administrator, sits in his small bedroom, illuminated only by the blue glow of his monitor. He is not searching for bank accounts or state secrets. He is in pursuit of the truth. Gary is a ufologist. He firmly believes that the U.S. government conceals technologies obtained from extraterrestrials. He read testimonies from eyewitnesses who claimed to have seen photographs of extraterrestrial crafts and lists of alien officers in NASA and the Pentagon. Using an old computer equipped with a 56 kilobit per second modem, a speed at which downloading a single song took half an hour, Gary embarked on his quest. He developed a simple program in Perl that scanned thousands of computers across the networks of the American Army, Navy, and NASA, searching for machines without passwords, and he found hundreds of them. Over the course of 2 years, from February 2001 to March 2002, Gary McKinnon had almost unrestricted access to the world's most secret networks. He wandered through the virtual halls of the Pentagon, the U.S. Space Command, and the Navy's laboratories. He did this not with malicious intent. He felt like a child in a candy store. He left messages on military computer screens such as, "Your security is crap." One time, he stumbled upon a folder titled, "Alien Officers." He began downloading a file, but his slow connection cut out halfway through. On another occasion, he accessed a computer at the Johnson Space Center in Houston and saw a high-resolution image on the screen. It depicted a silver, disc-shaped object hovering over the northern hemisphere. He was convinced it was an alien ship. But at that moment, a NASA engineer noticed the cursor moving on his screen and disconnected the session, although his activities were not without consequence. After the attacks on September 11, 2001, the American authorities were in a state of paranoia. When they discovered the breach, they deemed it a cyber-terrorism act. Gary's actions disrupted a network of 2,000 computers in the Washington Military District, responsible for securing the Capitol for 24 hours. The damage was assessed at $700,000. In 2002, he was arrested. The U.S. requested his extradition, accusing him of the largest military computer breach in history. He faced a potential 70-year prison sentence. For 10 years, he fought his extradition. His lawyers argued that he was not a terrorist, but merely a curious oddball with Asperger's syndrome. Ultimately, the British government denied the U.S. request for extradition. Gary McKinnon never found conclusive evidence of extraterrestrials, yet he demonstrated that sometimes the most secure system in the world can be breached by a determined individual in pajamas. Gary searched for ships in the sky, but the hero of our next story discovered a ship on the ground in the desert. He was an archaeologist who unearthed the ancient solar bark of Pharaoh Khufu and paid for this discovery with a curse that haunted him for his entire life. Story number 28, The Curse of the Solar Bark and the Archaeologist Who Was Afraid to Sleep. Egypt, Giza Plateau, 1954. The scorching sun melts stones at the base of the Great Pyramid of Khufu. A young Egyptian archaeologist, Kamal El-Malak, oversees routine work to clear debris from the southern wall of the pyramid. Suddenly, a worker stumbles upon a gigantic limestone slab. Beneath it are 41 more. This is the roof of an airtight, sealed underground chamber. Kamal realizes he is on the verge of a discovery of the century. He drills a small hole into one of the slabs, lowers a mirror to catch the sunbeam, and peers inside. The scent of cedar and incense, sealed for 4,500 years, strikes him in the face. Below, in pristine condition, lies a giant wooden vessel disassembled into parts. This was the solar bark of Pharaoh Khufu, a burial ship meant to transport the king's soul along the celestial Nile to the afterlife. The discovery was on par with the significance of Tutankhamun's tomb unveiling. Kamal El-Malak became an instant hero. Newspapers around the globe reported on him, but that very night, when he peered into the tomb, his life spiraled into a nightmare. He dreamt a disturbing dream. He saw Pharaoh Khufu standing on his bark, pointing a finger at him. "You have disturbed my peace," the specter spoke. "You will pay for this." From that day onward, Kamal could no longer sleep. Night after night, he was haunted by nightmares. Sometimes he found himself drowning in the Nile. At other times, he was buried under sand in the desert, or chased by mummies through the corridors of the pyramid. He grew thinner and more irritable. Fear of the dark began to consume him. His friends, fellow scholars, laughed at him. "Kamal, you are a rational man. What a curse! It's just the stress of fame. Yet strange occurrences continued. The chief restorer working on the bark's assembly died from a heart attack right at his workstation. The photographer who took the first pictures was killed in a car crash. Kamal became obsessed with the notion that the spirit of the pharaoh was seeking vengeance. He moved from his apartment to a small house right by the pyramid so he could be closer to the pharaoh and seek forgiveness. He secured 5 locks on his bedroom door even though he lived alone. For 31 years, he lived in the shadow of his monumental discovery. In 1985, Kamal El-Malak, now aged and weary from insomnia, took his own life. In his suicide note, he penned, "I can no longer endure. The Pharaoh calls me. I am going to him." Whether this was a real curse or merely a product of a man's imagination, crushed by the weight of responsibility, we may never know. However, the tale of the cursed bark became a warning for anyone daring to disturb the sleep of eternity. Kamal El-Malak unearthed a ship buried underground, but the heroes of our next story constructed a vessel above ground to soar into the sky, and their flight became the most incredible and touching adventure in the history of aviation. Story number 29. The paper bag that opened the sky to humanity. France, the town of Annonay, in the year 1782. Joseph Michel Montgolfier, a paper mill owner, is seated by the fireplace. He thoughtfully watches the smoke and hot air carry the ashes up the chimney. In his mind, a dreamer's and inventor's mind, an idea emerges with such force that it will change the world. What if I could capture this smoke in a paper bag, he speculates. Will the bag ascend like the ashes? He creates a small silk bag, holds it over the fire, and it soars to the ceiling. Joseph and his brother Jacques-Étienne embark on their grand experiment. They are not physicists by trade. They mistakenly believe that the lift is caused not by the hot air, but by a special gas, Montgolfier gas, contained within the smoke. Thus, they burn not just wood on the fire, but also wet straw and old wool rags to produce a thicker, smellier smoke. On the 4th of June in 1783, they held the first public demonstration. In the town square, they inflated a gigantic balloon made of canvas and paper. It soared to an altitude of 2,000 meters and traveled 2 kilometers. The crowd was both terrified and thrilled. People thought it was witchcraft. The news reached Paris all the way to King Louis XV. The brothers were invited to Versailles. On the 19th of September in 1783, the court at the Palace of Versailles was gathered. All of the French nobility, including Queen Marie Antoinette, were present. The Montgolfier brothers showcased their luxurious new balloon, adorned in blue with golden patterns. However, a question arose. Could a living creature withstand flight in the foul air at such heights? The king suggested sending 2 death row prisoners on the flight. If they survived, they would be pardoned. The brothers protested, arguing that the first flight should be an honor, not a punishment. They proposed sending animals instead. Thus, the first aeronauts in human history became a ram, a duck, and a rooster. They were placed in a woven basket, suspended beneath the balloon. Amidst the sound of a cannon salute, the balloon lifted off into the sky. It flew for 8 minutes before gently landing in a forest 3 kilometers away from Versailles. The animals emerged alive and well. The rooster had indeed injured its wing, but it turned out to be merely a peck from the ram in the cramped basket. The path to the skies was now open. On the 21st of November of the same year, 2 brave souls, scientists Pilatre de Rosier and Marquis d'Arlincourt, made the first historical free flight of a human in a hot air balloon. They rose above the rooftops of Paris, waving to astonished city dwellers, extinguishing the heated balloon envelope with buckets of water, and landed safely. In just 6 months, the 2 brothers who were paper manufacturers, inspired by smoke rising from the chimney, opened a completely new era for humanity, the era of ballooning. The Montgolfier brothers paved the way to the heavens, but the hero of our final story opened the path to space, even though his name is nearly forgotten. He was a self-taught genius, a deaf school teacher who derived the formula for rocket flight in his modest cabin in Kaluga, half a century before Gagarin. This is the story of a 30, the deaf dreamer who heard the music of space. In Russia, In the city of Kaluga, at the end of the 19th century, lived Konstantin Eduardovich Tsiolkovsky, a humble teacher of arithmetic and geometry, residing in a small wooden house on the outskirts of town. As a child, he nearly lost his hearing after suffering from scarlet fever. The world of sound was forever closed to him. Yet it was in this silence that he began to hear what no one else could, the whispers of the stars. Tsiolkovsky was a self-taught individual. He was expelled from school and gained all his knowledge from books in the library. He crafted hearing tubes and built models of dirigibles, but his true passion lay with space. At a time when flying in an airplane was still a fantasy, this deaf provincial teacher dreamed of journeys to the moon and Mars. His ideas likely seemed pure madness to contemporaries. He wrote scientific papers on weightlessness, multi-stage rockets, and spacesuits. He sketched designs for orbital stations resembling gigantic rotating wheels, where centrifugal force would create artificial gravity. The scientific community ignored him. His articles went unpublished. He became the subject of ridicule, mocked as the Kaluga eccentric. He lives in poverty, spending his meager salary on chemical reagents for experiments. Yet he does not give up. In 1903, his monumental work on exploring cosmic spaces with reactive devices was published in a little-known journal called Scientific Review. Within this article, amid intricate calculations, there existed one formula. Today, it is recognized by every rocket engineer as the Tsiolkovsky formula. It mathematically established that the only method to overcome Earth's gravity is through a liquid-fueled rocket. He calculated the velocity necessary for orbiting and demonstrated its feasibility. This formula is the cornerstone of all astronautics. Tsiolkovsky never constructed a single rocket. He was a theorist, a prophet. He stated, "Earth is the cradle of reason, but one cannot remain in the cradle forever." He passed away in 1935 without witnessing the realization of his ideas. However, his work did not vanish. It was carefully studied by a young engineer, Sergei Korolev, who later built the rocket that sent the first satellite and the first human into orbit. Wernher von Braun, the architect of the American lunar program, regarded Tsiolkovsky as his mentor. When Yuri Gagarin flew into space, he was effectively following the trajectory calculated by a deaf teacher from Kaluga half a century earlier in the silence of his cottage. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, a man who could not hear the voices of people, heard the call of the universe and charted a path to the stars for humanity. Once again, we close the final folder. 30 stories, 30 incredible destinies. We witnessed a man selling a tower he did not own and an army losing a war to birds. We saw people survive on the ocean floor and in the skies, building castles from trash and entire forests from a single seed. These chronicles are not just a collection of curiosities. They are proof that within each of us lies a spark of madness, genius, stubbornness, and a love for life that can transform the world. Reality is far richer and stranger than any fiction. One only needs to learn to listen to its quiet voice. Our archive once more sinks into silence, but the stories within it do not slumber. They await their moment to be told again. Thank you for spending this time with me. Seek out your own incredible stories, for they are everywhere. M.